The neighborhood looked picture-perfect from the outside. Rows of identical homes lined the quiet cul-de-sac, each with perfectly trimmed hedges, polished driveways, and regulation-approved shutters. To the casual eye, it was a slice of suburban heaven. But anyone who had lived there long enough knew the truth. This wasn't paradise. This was a battlefield, carefully patrolled and policed not by real officers, but by the Homeowners Association. The HOA wasn't just strict. They were ruthless. Every lawn had to be cut to exactly 2 inches. No mailbox could deviate in color, and even the way trash bins were placed on collection day was tightly controlled. Infractions meant fines, and fines meant constant harassment. The board members, led by an iron-fisted president, took particular pride in singling out homeowners who didn't conform to their exact standards. For years, I had tried to live quietly, blending in where possible, keeping my head down while others fought their battles. But inevitably, it was only a matter of time before the HOA turned its sights on me. It began with letters, innocuous at first, reminders about lawn care, suggestions about repainting the trim. Then came warnings. They claimed my fence was a half-inch too high, my shed too close to the property line, my holiday decorations too bright. Each notice carried the sting of a fine, and each fine escalated their hostility. What the HOA didn't know, however, was who I really was. To them, I was just another homeowner, another victim of their petty power games. But in reality, I held a badge, a position of authority they couldn't begin to comprehend. I wasn't just any cop. I was the chief of police in our town. My career demanded restraint, demanded that I walk carefully, that I never abuse the position I had sworn to uphold. So I ignored their pettiness as long as I could, convinced that logic or simple patience would eventually calm their obsession. But I was wrong. The harassment escalated. Anonymous notes appeared in my mailbox, threatening legal action. Neighbors whispered that the board had been spreading rumors about me, accusing me of breaking rules, disrespecting community values, even implying I was dangerous. Each lie was designed to isolate me, to turn the neighborhood against me. It was no longer about fences or sheds. It was about control. Then came the day when their tactics took a darker turn. It began as an ordinary afternoon. I was home after a long shift, exhausted, ready to sink into the silence of my living room, when a loud knock echoed through the house. Standing at the door were 2 men dressed in what looked like police uniforms. Their posture was stiff, their demeanor aggressive, their voices clipped and commanding. They told me they were there on behalf of the HOA, that I had broken community laws, and that I was under arrest. At first glance, the uniforms looked official, but years of experience had trained my eyes. The badges were wrong. The belts were incomplete. The insignia on their shirts didn't match any department in the county. These weren't officers. They were imposters, thugs dressed in costumes hired to intimidate me into submission. For a moment, anger boiled in my chest. The HOA had crossed a line. They had shifted from petty fines and harassment to criminal intimidation. They were playing a dangerous game, one they didn't realize they could never win, because the man they were trying to scare wasn't just another homeowner. I was the very authority they pretended to represent. I calmly reached into my pocket, pulling out the badge I had carried for decades. The moment I held it up, the imposters froze, their fake confidence cracking like thin glass. Confusion clouded their eyes as the realization dawned. They had tried to arrest the chief of police. The standoff lasted only a heartbeat before they stumbled backward, muttering excuses, their fake uniforms suddenly looking more like costumes than symbols of power. I didn't move. I didn't need to. My presence, my badge, spoke louder than any words could. But as they retreated down the driveway, I knew this was only the beginning. The HOA had declared war, and in their arrogance, they had exposed themselves to something they could no longer control. What they didn't understand yet was that their desperate attempt to break me had unleashed something they would never contain. And I was done playing nice. The neighborhood had just become my crime scene. The imposters thought they could vanish into the shadows of the suburban streets, blending back into the quiet calm of the neighborhood as though nothing had happened. But when they ran from my driveway, they left behind more than their fear. They left evidence, tiny details no untrained eye would have noticed, but to me, they were flashing signals. Their uniforms were cheap, poorly stitched, bought from some costume supplier rather than issued by any department. Their boots weren't standard issue either, scuffed and mismatched. And their vehicle, parked just a few houses down, was the biggest giveaway of all. It was an old sedan, hastily covered with magnetic decals that read, "Community Security." The words were crooked, peeling at the edges. No department in the country operated cars like that. It was nothing more than a civilian vehicle dressed up to intimidate. I stood at the end of my driveway, memorizing the license plate as they scrambled. Into the car. The engine roared to life, and within seconds they were gone, tires squealing as they disappeared around the corner. But I wasn't worried. I had the tools to track them. Inside my office, I sat down at my desk, pulled up the regional system, and entered the plate number. The computer returned results almost instantly. It wasn't a registered law enforcement vehicle. In fact, it belonged to a rental company located just outside town. The rental agreement listed a name I recognized, a name I had seen at the bottom of nearly every warning letter shoved into my mailbox over the last year. It was none other than the HOA president herself. The connection was undeniable. The so-called officers weren't just random impersonators. They were working directly under her orders, sent to my house to scare me, to make me believe the HOA's rules carried the same weight as the law. And now I had proof. But I couldn't move recklessly. I knew the dangers of revealing my position too soon. If I went storming into the HOA's office with accusations, they would deny everything, twist the narrative, and claim I was harassing them. That was their specialty. Gaslighting, manipulating, turning neighbors against one another. Instead, I needed to be patient. I needed to treat this like the investigation it had become. The first step was gathering more evidence. Over the next week, I watched carefully. I kept my patrol car parked away from the house, using my personal vehicle to avoid raising suspicion. I set up cameras around my property, small and discreet, positioned to catch anyone who came near. Within days, they delivered. Late one night, a figure crept across my lawn. The motion sensor triggered, and the footage revealed exactly what I expected. It was one of the same imposters who had come to my door. He wasn't wearing the fake uniform this time. Instead, he carried a folder, stuffing something into my mailbox before scurrying away into the dark. In the morning, I found another notice. The HOA was escalating fines, claiming I was now in violation of multiple community laws and threatening legal action. Each letter was more aggressive than the last. They accused me of property neglect, noise violations, and refusal to comply with community enforcement. The language grew bolder, more threatening, carefully crafted to sound like it carried the weight of real legal authority. But I knew better. These weren't laws. These were scare tactics. Still, I documented everything. Each letter went into a file. Each video clip was saved and backed up. I photographed the tire marks the imposters left in front of my house, the shoe prints pressed into my lawn, even the way their cheap decals had begun to peel from the car. To the average homeowner, it might have looked like nothing. To me, it was a trail of evidence. Meanwhile, the HOA board continued their charade as though nothing had happened. They held meetings, sitting in their little clubhouse with smug smiles, handing out fines and warnings to anyone who dared step out of line. Neighbors complained quietly about them in whispers, but dared not confront them openly. They had seen what happened to people who resisted. The HOA could make your life miserable. But what they didn't know was that the board had chosen the wrong target this time. They weren't up against a timid homeowner. They were up against the chief of police. The more I uncovered, the clearer the picture became. The imposters were part of a small private security outfit run by a former board member, someone the HOA president had close ties with. The uniforms were ordered online, the decals printed at a local sign shop, the rental car signed out under the HOA's account. Every step was traceable, every piece connected back to them, but I also knew I couldn't rush the takedown. If I moved too early, they'd bury the evidence and spin themselves as victims. I needed them to dig their own graves deeper, to expose themselves so thoroughly that when the time came, no one could deny what they had done. So I waited. I endured their harassment with a steady calm, collecting more and more proof. And as I did, I began to see the fear growing in their eyes. They noticed my silence, my lack of reaction, and it unsettled them. They were used to homeowners breaking down, begging, complying. But I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I simply documented, one careful step at a time. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the neighborhood lights flickered, I received an unexpected call from a trusted colleague in another department. He had caught wind of something unusual. A complaint had been filed downtown, one that claimed I was an unfit neighbor, accused of disturbing the peace, of being a threat to the community. The complaint wasn't filed by just anyone. It was signed by the HOA president herself. They were trying to use my own profession against me, and that was the final mistake. The HOA president thought she was clever. Filing an official complaint against me wasn't just petty, it was dangerous. She had crossed a boundary most people wouldn't dare approach. She was gambling on the idea that her authority within the neighborhood could spill over into the real world, that by throwing accusations into a system she didn't understand, she could undermine me. But what she didn't realize was that the system she tried to weaponize was one I knew better than anyone. Every form, every procedure, every loophole, it was my world. And she had just handed me the perfect excuse to escalate my own investigation. The complaint itself was laughable. It listed vague accusations, disturbing the peace, aggressive behavior toward board members, intimidation of neighbors. No dates, no evidence, nothing tangible to support the claims. It was a smear campaign, nothing more. But it bore her name at the bottom, alongside the HOA's letterhead. That made it official enough for me to open a formal inquiry. The beauty of investigations like this lies not in confrontation, but in patience. A criminal, when left unchecked, will almost always reveal themselves, and the HOA was no exception. Their arrogance blinded them. They believed they were untouchable, that homeowners were too afraid to fight back, that their fabricated authority gave them real power. So I played along. I allowed the process to unfold, documenting every step. I met with colleagues quietly, explaining the situation in careful detail, providing them with the early evidence I had gathered. Each piece was logged, time-stamped, filed in a growing case. The imposter officers, the rental car, the falsified uniforms, the threatening letters, and now the baseless complaint. It was all connected. At the same time, I began to lay the groundwork for a trap. I wanted them to feel confident, to believe. Their tactics were working so that they would double down, and, predictably, they did. The following week, the HOA called for an emergency neighborhood meeting. Flyers appeared in every mailbox announcing that important matters concerning a disruptive homeowner would be discussed. The implication was obvious. They were trying to rally the neighborhood against me, to turn public opinion into yet another weapon. I attended the meeting quietly, sitting in the back of the clubhouse as the president stood at the podium. She spoke with her usual self-righteous authority, painting herself as the savior of the neighborhood, the protector of its values. She described a certain homeowner who had repeatedly violated community laws, who had disrespected the board, who had even, she claimed, threatened them with retaliation. Gasps rippled through the room. But what she didn't know was that every word she spoke was being recorded. The cameras I carried weren't flashy, weren't obvious, but they were good enough to capture everything. Each false accusation, each misleading claim. It all became evidence. Evidence of defamation, evidence of harassment, evidence of organized misconduct under the guise of community enforcement. And as I watched her posture at the podium, I realized something else. She wasn't just drunk on power, she was terrified. Her voice wavered when she spoke my name, though she avoided saying it directly. Her hands trembled slightly when she waved her notes in the air. Deep down she knew she had gone too far. But pride and ego wouldn't let her stop. The meeting ended with the board announcing new enforcement measures. They claimed they were hiring professional officers to maintain order in the neighborhood. I almost laughed out loud. They weren't even hiding it anymore. They were openly doubling down on their stunt with the fake police, pretending their little charade carried legal weight. That was exactly what I needed. The very next day, I met with the city attorney and laid everything out on the table. The evidence was overwhelming. Impersonating law enforcement, filing false complaints, issuing fraudulent fines, these weren't just HOA politics anymore. These were crimes, serious ones. But I wasn't satisfied with just legal action. No, I wanted them exposed, completely, and undeniably, in front of the very people they had been manipulating. And for that, I needed one final push. So I set the trap. I drafted a letter, deliberately vague, and sent it to the HOA office. It stated that I would not comply with their so-called enforcement, that I refused to pay their escalating fines, that I would face whatever consequences they chose to bring. It was bait, pure and simple, and I knew they would bite. Days later, I saw the same suspicious car circling my block again. The imposters had returned. This time, they came at night, their cheap uniforms slightly more polished, their fake badges gleaming under the streetlights. They walked with exaggerated authority, knocking on my door with the same false bravado as before. But this time I was ready. Hidden cameras recorded every second. A small team of real officers I trusted waited quietly out of sight, parked down the street. I opened the door, let the imposters deliver their little speech, watched them puff their chests as they declared I was under arrest on behalf of the HOA. And then, with perfect timing, the unmarked cars rolled in. Real officers, real authority, surrounding my house in seconds. The imposters froze, caught in the act, their faces draining of color as reality crashed down on them. They weren't arresting anyone. They were the ones under arrest. The moment was surreal. Years of HOA intimidation, months of harassment, weeks of planning, it all came to a head in that instant. The imposters were cuffed, their fake uniforms confiscated, their pathetic excuses recorded for the record. But as they were driven away, I knew the job wasn't done. They were pawns, nothing more. The real battle was still ahead. The HOA president and her board had orchestrated everything, and their reckoning had yet to arrive. The trap had been sprung. The evidence was airtight. And now it was time to bring the entire operation crashing down. The night the imposters were arrested sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Word traveled faster than I anticipated. By sunrise, whispers had turned into full-blown rumors. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact with me now lingered in their yards, pretending to water plants or collect mail, eager to catch a glimpse of what was happening. They knew something big had gone down, and curiosity burned brighter than fear. The sight of the fake officers being hauled away had left its mark. Some residents had seen the flashing lights. Others had heard the shouting as the imposters were cuffed. The HOA's image of unshakable authority had cracked. For the first time, people questioned whether the board's threats and fines were legitimate at all. But while the neighborhood buzzed with speculation, the HOA president doubled down. The very next morning, an email blast went out to every homeowner. It painted the imposters as contracted security, claiming they had been wrongfully detained due to a misunderstanding with local authorities. The president insisted the HOA was still in control, still protecting the values of the community, and that any homeowner siding against them was jeopardizing the safety and integrity of the neighborhood. It was a desperate move. The wording was defensive, frantic, laced with cracks of panic hidden beneath the polished tone. But it also meant one thing: they weren't backing down. And that was exactly what I wanted. The case against the board was already strong. With the imposters in custody, investigators traced payments back to HOA funds, dues collected from unsuspecting homeowners. Financial records showed that thousands of dollars had been funneled into hiring these so-called security officers. The money trail was undeniable. But it wasn't just about fraud. It was about betrayal. These were people who had trusted their neighbors to manage common property, maintain community spaces, and ensure fairness. Instead, their money was being used to fund intimidation schemes and criminal activity. Every receipt, every transfer, every forged contract was evidence of a board out of control. Still, exposure meant nothing unless it reached the people who had suffered under the HOA's thumb. For years, residents had paid fines for trivial things: paint a shade too bright, grass half an inch too tall, holiday decorations left up a day too long. Each infraction was met with threats, each letter dripping with condescension and authority. Many had complied out of fear. Some had even moved away to escape it. Now, they finally had a chance to fight back. I knew the board would never willingly step down, so the only way forward was to confront them publicly. A neighborhood meeting was scheduled, one that promised to be the turning point. The board believed they were gathering to reassure the community, to spin their lies into a narrative of strength. But I had other plans. When the day arrived, the clubhouse was packed. More residents showed up than I'd ever seen before. The air buzzed with tension. People wanted answers. They wanted to know why men in fake uniforms had been parading around their streets. They wanted to know where their money had gone. The HOA president walked in with her usual arrogance, flanked by board members who looked less confident than usual. She took the podium, adjusting her papers with an air of control she didn't truly have. She began with rehearsed lines about miscommunication and unfortunate incidents, insisting that the HOA's actions had been in the best interest of the community. But the room wasn't buying it. The polite silence that usually greeted her speeches was gone. Murmurs of disapproval grew louder with every word. Homeowners exchanged skeptical glances, arms crossed, jaws set. The control she once commanded had slipped through her fingers, and then it was my turn. I stood, walked to the front, and placed a stack of documents on the table. Bank statements, contracts, photographs, and video recordings, all neatly organized, undeniable, irrefutable. I explained, calmly and clearly, how funds had been misused, how imposters had been hired to pose as police officers, how intimidation tactics had been carried out with money taken directly from the very people sitting in that room. Gasps filled the air. Papers rustled as neighbors leaned forward to see. Shock turned to outrage, outrage to fury. I didn't need to embellish. The evidence spoke for itself. Every video clip, every financial trail, every fraudulent act painted a picture of corruption too blatant to ignore. And then, for the final blow, I played the recording from the emergency meeting weeks earlier, the one where the president had stood at the podium and openly lied about me, painting me as a threat to the neighborhood. Her own words echoed through the speakers, dripping with arrogance and deceit. When the recording ended, the room erupted. Neighbors demanded her resignation, shouted for accountability, demanded answers she couldn't provide. The board members beside her squirmed, whispering nervously among themselves, their faces pale. The president tried to regain control, raising her voice above the chaos. insisting it was all a misunderstanding. But the tide had turned. Her authority was gone, stripped away not by force, but by truth. And as the shouting grew louder, I simply stepped back, letting the community speak for itself. Years of pent-up frustration, years of silent suffering under the HOA's rule, all spilled out. In that moment, what had once been fear turned into strength. They weren't afraid anymore. The meeting ended in chaos, with the board members fleeing the room under a barrage of angry voices. It was the beginning of their end. Investigators had the evidence, the community had the truth, and the board's carefully constructed facade had collapsed. But even as the neighborhood celebrated, I knew the fight wasn't over. People like the HOA president don't surrender quietly. She would cling to power until the very last second, clawing for control even as it slipped from her grasp. The board had been exposed, but exposure wasn't enough. The next step would be dismantling them completely, legally, publicly, and permanently. The battle wasn't finished. It had only just entered its final stage. The HOA board had been stripped of its power in the eyes of the neighborhood, but the battle wasn't truly won until the law stepped in. For weeks, investigators had been compiling everything we uncovered: financial mismanagement, fraudulent contracts, impersonation of law enforcement, and harassment of residents. The walls were closing in, and the president knew it. Her emails became frantic. Gone were the perfectly composed newsletters filled with rules and threats. Instead, she sent out desperate pleas, trying to convince homeowners that she was the victim, that everything uncovered was fabricated, that I, the chief of police, had orchestrated some kind of vendetta against her. But the community had seen too much. They weren't fooled anymore. Neighbors who once cowered under her authority now stood tall. They refused to pay fines, refused to follow arbitrary rules, and demanded their dues be refunded. The clubhouse sat empty, its once regular HOA meetings abandoned. The neighborhood pool, once off-limits after arbitrary hours, was now filled with children playing freely. The control she had wielded so ruthlessly for years evaporated overnight, and then came the arrest warrant. It wasn't just for misuse of HOA funds. It was for conspiracy, fraud, and impersonation by proxy. The fake officers she had hired had cut a deal, testifying against the very person who had orchestrated the scheme. Every dollar she had stolen, every intimidation tactic she had planned, every neighbor she had bullied, it all came back to her. The day of her arrest will forever be remembered by the neighborhood. The real police cars rolled in, lights flashing, sirens piercing the calm morning air. This time, there were no fake uniforms, no staged threats. This was justice. Residents poured out of their houses, watching from porches and sidewalks as the woman who had once lorded over them was led away in handcuffs. Her usual scowl had twisted into a mask of desperation. She shouted about misunderstandings, about conspiracies, about her innocence. But no one believed her anymore. The same neighbors she had bullied now watched silently, some shaking their heads, others smiling at the poetic justice unfolding before their eyes. The rest of the board didn't escape unscathed. Some faced fines, others were barred from ever serving on any HOA again. The money they had taken was ordered to be repaid, with restitution checks sent back to every homeowner who had been wrongfully fined or overcharged. It was more than just a legal victory. It was symbolic. The power dynamic had shifted. For the first time, the community was truly free. In the aftermath, a new system was put in place. The neighborhood voted to dissolve the HOA entirely, dismantling the structure that had once been used as a weapon. Instead, a voluntary community group formed, one dedicated not to control but to cooperation. Events replaced enforcement. Barbecues replaced board meetings. The neighborhood became what it should have always been, a place of peace, not intimidation. As for me, I remained the chief of police, but also something more. To many of the residents, I had become a symbol of resistance, of standing up against corruption no matter where it came from. Not because I wore a badge, but because I refused to bow to tyranny, even the kind that hides behind HOA bylaws and petty fines. Looking back, I realized the HOA's downfall wasn't just about fraudulent money or fake cops. It was about what happens when ordinary people are pushed too far, when fear turns to courage, and when truth finally sees the light of day. The president thought she could scare me, humiliate me, break me. She thought fake officers at my doorstep would leave me powerless. What she didn't realize was that her biggest mistake wasn't hiring imposters. It was underestimating who she was up against. Because when the day came that she tried to weaponize fear against me, she discovered the truth. I wasn't just another homeowner. I was the chief of police. And in the end, the badge I carried wasn't just a shield for me. It became the shield for the entire neighborhood. The HOA had fallen, justice had prevailed, and peace had finally returned to the community.